"Excuse me," a woman whispered from behind. I turned to see an elderly lady with short gray hair and glasses. "The person behind you. They've been following you through every aisle." I glanced back casually. A tall guy with dark hair stood 3 people behind us, looking down at his phone. Blue jacket, just like she'd said. I asked if she was sure, and she confirmed that she had noticed him following me from electronics to household goods and then to books, always maintaining the same distance. I thanked her for letting me know while trying to act normal and looking around for store security. At the cashier, I paid quickly, keeping an eye on Blue Jacket. He stayed in line, not watching me anymore. Maybe the woman was confused. Still, I hurried to the parking lot and loaded my car faster than usual. On the drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror. No Blue Jacket, just my imagination running wild. I pulled into my apartment complex and grabbed only the essentials: milk, eggs, bread, leaving the rest for later. My phone rang as I unlocked my door. Adrian, my ex-boyfriend from college, calling after 3 years of silence. When I answered, he explained that he needed to talk to me and asked if we could meet. After hesitating, I agreed to meet him at the park near the library on Wednesday. When Wednesday came, I arrived at the park 15 minutes early. I chose a spot near the fountain. Adrian appeared at exactly to I, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. He hugged me awkwardly and thanked me for meeting him. He admitted he'd been trying to figure out how to approach me. I pointed out that he could have texted first, and he confessed he wasn't sure I'd respond. After removing his sunglasses, he told me he'd seen something at my sister's wedding last month. Surprised, I asked how he was at Anne's wedding since he wasn't invited. He explained that his cousin Lucas is friends with Troy, Anne's husband, and he was Lucas's +1. When I asked why he didn't say hello, he revealed it was because he saw Sheila, my mother. I shook my head and told him that was impossible since my mother wasn't at the wedding and had died when I was 12. Adrian insisted that he knew what my mom looked like from photos, and that the woman at table 8 was definitely her. Getting upset, I stood up and told him this was crazy. I explained that my mother was dead, and I went to her funeral. He asked if I saw her body, and I told him it was a closed casket because she died in a car accident. As I grabbed my purse and started to leave, he called after me, saying she had looked right at him and recognized him from when we dated. I drove straight to Anne's place across town, my hands tied on the steering wheel. She opened the door wearing pajamas despite it being afternoon. I told her we needed to talk about Mom, and then went pale, asking what about her. When I mentioned Adrian saying he saw her at the wedding and poured herself a glass of water and said he must be mistaken. I agreed that's what I told him too, but mentioned he seemed so sure, and sat at the kitchen table and started to reveal the truth. She didn't die in that accident. Dad made it up that they were getting divorced, and trailed off. She left us. Dad couldn't handle the truth, so he told us she died. I couldn't believe it, mentioning there was a funeral, and explained it was an empty casket and that Dad had paid the funeral director to go along with it. I walked out without another word, driving aimlessly until I found myself at Dad's house. He opened the door and took one look at my face. He immediately knew and had told me. When I asked how he could lie about something like that, he invited me in. "Your mother abandoned us for another man," Dad said. "I thought it would be easier for you girls to think she died a hero than to know she chose to leave." When I started to ask about all these years, he admitted he never expected her to come back, especially not to Anne's wedding. I stayed with Dad for hours, asking questions about Mom, about the lie, about what really happened. As the sun set, I drove to the supermarket. Eating some time alone, I wandered through the aisles, grabbing random items. As I turned into the dairy section, I froze. A woman with familiar eyes studied the yogurt selection. Older, with different hair, but unmistakably my mother. First update. So I posted about finding out my supposedly dead mother is actually alive. And holy hell, the comments blew up. Someone told me to get a lawyer. Someone else said to check if I'm even legally my dad's daughter. What? And like 50 people told me to run. She saw me at the exact same moment. Her hand froze on a container of Greek yogurt. For about 10 seconds, we just stared at each other like the deer who both heard a gunshot. Then she put the yogurt back, adjusted her purse strap, and started walking toward the exit. I followed her, not in a creepy stalking way, but I literally jogged to catch up. I called up Mom, and she stopped, but didn't turn around. When I got closer, I could see her shoulders were shaking. She turned, and I got a good look at her face. Same green eyes I see in the mirror every morning. Same slightly crooked nose, but older, obviously. With lines around her mouth I didn't remember from the photos Dad had hidden in the attic. She asked how I was doing, and I actually laughed. Like a weird, hysterical laugh that made other shoppers look at us. I told her I was doing great. Thanks for asking. Just found out my dead mother has been alive this whole time. So, yeah, peachy. She flinched. Then she suggested we go somewhere to talk. I thought about saying no, about walking away and letting her feel what it's like to be abandoned. But I needed answers more than I needed petty revenge. We ended up at a 24-hour diner, the kind of place with sticky menus and a waitress who calls everyone honey. We sat in a booth near the back. She ordered coffee. I ordered a Coke because I was not going to pretend this was some casual catch-up over hot beverages. She started by saying she didn't know I'd be at the wedding, and I cut her off. I told her and invited her. She nodded and explained Troy's mother had sent the invitation to her current address months ago, and she debated for weeks before deciding to go. Current address, like she's been living somewhere all along. Somewhere close enough to get mail about my sister's wedding. I asked where, and she said Harrisburg, an hour and a half away. For 13 years, she'd been an hour and a half away. She told me she understood I was angry, and I said no. I don't think she does understand. I told her I cried myself to sleep for 2 years thinking she was dead. I told her I kept her photo under my pillow until I was 15. I told her dad had to get me therapy because I was having nightmares about car accidents. She started crying then. Real tears, not the pretty kind. The waitress brought our drinks and backed away quickly like she sensed the emotional warfare happening. My mother said she never meant for any of this to happen, and that it was supposed to be temporary. She explained she left dad because he was controlling, because she felt suffocated, because she needed space to figure out who she was. She said she was going to come back for us, for me and Ann. I asked when, and she went quiet. Then she admitted, maybe 6 months after she left. Dad told her if she ever tried to contact us, he'd make sure we never wanted to see her again. He'd tell us she abandoned us for drugs, for another man, for money. He said he'd turn us against her completely. So she just gave up. That's what I asked. She just accepted it and moved on with her life. She insisted she didn't move on and revealed she kept track of us through mutual friends. She knew when I graduated high school, went and got into nursing school. When I got my job, she showed me her phone. She had photos of me from Facebook, from Instagram, from Anne's public posts. Years of photos she'd been collecting like some kind of digital scrapbook. It was creepy and sad and made me angrier somehow. I asked about the man Dad said she left for and her face changed. She confirmed there was someone. His name was Timothy and he worked with her. They'd been having an affair for about 4 months before she left. At least Dad hadn't lied about everything. She quickly added that Timothy and her didn't work out. It ended within a year. She said looking back she'd made terrible choices, that she'd been selfish and stupid and young. She was 32 when she left. Not exactly a teenager figuring out life. But here's where it gets messy. She told me she tried to reach out once. When I was 16, she sent a letter to our old house, but Dad returned it unopened. She tried calling from a new number, but Dad recognized her voice and hung up. She said she even drove by my high school one day, but saw me laughing with friends and decided I looked happy enough without her. I told her she doesn't get to make that call. She doesn't get to decide from a car window whether I needed my mother or not. She agreed. She said she was a coward and that watching and get married, seeing how beautiful and grown she was, seeing me in the family photos on Troy's mother's Facebook, it broke something in her. She realized she'd lost 13 years. She could never get back. I asked if she had other kids and she said no. I asked if she was married and she said no. I asked what the hell she'd been doing for 13 years and she said working as a secretary, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, and regretting every single day of her pathetic life. The bitterness in her voice when she said pathetic made me think maybe she wasn't lying about the regret part. We sat there for probably 2 hours. She told me about her life in Harrisburg, about her cat named Button, about how she volunteers at a food bank on Saturdays. Like these mundane details would somehow make up for everything. I asked if Anne knew she was alive before the wedding and my mother hesitated. Then she admitted Anne had reached out to her 3 years ago. 3 years. And had been in contact with her for 3 years and never told me. I stood up so fast I knocked my Coke over. The waitress rushed over with napkins. I left cash on the table and walked out. My mother called after me, but I kept walking. I drove straight to Anne's apartment. It was almost 10 p.m., but I didn't care. I banged on her door until she opened it. She took one look at my face and knew. She tried to explain. She said Mom had found her on Facebook, that she'd been scared and confused, that she didn't know how to tell me. She claimed she'd wanted to protect me from getting hurt again. I asked how secret conversations with our supposedly dead mother for 3 years was protecting me, and started crying and said Mom had begged her not to say anything until she was ready. Ready for what? I asked, ready to swoop back into our lives when it was convenient for her, and revealed Mom had been asking about me constantly, what I was doing, if I was dating anyone, if I was happy, and said she'd been giving her updates because it felt cruel not to. I told her what felt cruel was lying to my face for 3 years. Every time we had dinner, every holiday, every sister hangout where I'd mention Mom and get sad, and had known the truth and said nothing, and grabbed my arm and said I didn't understand the position she was in. She explained Mom was fragile, that she'd been in therapy, that she tried to end her life twice after leaving us. Twice, and had been terrified that if she told me, I'd reject Mom, and Mom would try again. So I was supposed to fake happy reunion to prevent our mother from harming herself. That's emotional blackmail, and insisted that wasn't what she meant, but I was done listening. I told her I needed space and left. When I got home, there was a text from Adrian asking if I was okay. That he'd heard from Lucas I'd been asking around about the wedding. Word travels fast. Apparently, I called him. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't lying to me. He answered on the first ring. I asked him to tell me exactly what he saw at the wedding. He described how he'd been sitting with Lucas at table 12 when he noticed a woman at table 8 who looked familiar. He said he thought maybe she was someone from college, but then he remembered the photos I used to keep sleep in my dorm room. The one of my mom holding me as a baby. The way she smiled in photos, kind of shy, kind of sad. This woman had that same smile. He said he'd mentioned it to Lucas, who told him that was Sheila. That Troy's mom had invited her because apparently Troy's mom and my mom had been friends back in the day. Lucas hadn't realized the connection to me until Adrian explained. I asked why he waited 3 years to tell me, and he said he didn't wait 3 years. He said he tried to bring it up casually the week after the wedding, but I've been weird and distant with him at the time. Then we broke up 2 months later, and he figured it wasn't his place anymore. Fair enough, I guess. Then he asked if I talked to her, and I told him, yeah, I had. He asked how it went, and I said, honestly, I have no idea. Part of me wants to tell her to stay in Harrisburg and leave me alone. Part of me has about a million more questions. He said that made sense and that he was around if I needed to talk. It was nice. Uncomplicated. No hidden agendas. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from and a voicemail from Dad asking me to call him back urgently. I called Dad first. He asked if I'd seen her, and I confirmed I had. There was a long silence. Dad said something I wasn't expecting. He told me Sheila had called him last night. After 13 years of silence, she called him and said she wanted to be part of our lives again. She wanted to make amends. She wanted a relationship with her daughters. And Dad, he told her no. He said he'd let her see and even wanted that, but she needed to stay away from me. He told her I was doing fine without her and she'd caused enough damage. I asked him who the hell gave him the right to make that choice for me, and he went quiet. Then he said he was trying to protect me, just like he'd always done. I told him his protection had been lies for 13 years and hung up. Now everyone's trying to control this situation. Dad wants to keep her away and wants to facilitate some happy reunion. Mom wants forgiveness and a do-over. But here's what nobody's asking. What do I want? I'm getting there, though. I'm figuring it out, because there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone yet. When I was leaving the diner, I saw someone in the parking lot, blue jacket guy from Costco, standing by a silver car watching the diner entrance. And when I drove past him, I got a clear look at his face. He looked exactly like my mother. Last update. Okay, so the comments on my last post were wild. Half of you thought blue jacket guy was a private investigator. The other half thought I was losing my mind. I called my mother the morning after I saw him and told her we needed to talk immediately. She asked if she could bring someone, and I said fine, whatever. An hour later, she showed up at my apartment with Sydney. He was tall for his age and looked so nervous I thought he might actually pass out on my doorstep. First thing he said was sorry for being a creep. He explained he'd been trying to work up the courage to introduce himself for weeks, but kept chickening out. That day at Costco, he'd finally decided to do it. But then that elderly woman had called him out and he'd panicked. I asked my mother to explain and she told me everything. She'd had Sydney 2 years after leaving us. His father, Ronald, had left when Sydney was a baby. She'd raised him alone in Harrisburg, which is only 90 minutes away. 90 minutes for 13 years. But here's the thing. As she was explaining, I watched Sydney's face. He looked as lost as I felt. This wasn't some evil plan. These were just broken people who'd made mistakes and were trying to figure out how to fix them. I asked Sydney what he wanted from this and he said, honestly, he just wanted to know his sisters. He'd grown up hearing about us, seeing old photos, knowing we existed, but never being able to meet us. He said it had felt like having ghost siblings. Something about the way he said it got to me. Because I'd had a ghost mother and it had sect. Sydney had ghost sisters. We'd all been haunted by people who were actually alive. I called in and told her to get to my apartment now. She showed up 20 minutes later and when she saw Sydney, her eyes went huge. I introduced them and just stared for a minute before saying, holy shit, we have a brother. Sydney laughed nervously and said, yeah, surprise. And asked him a million questions. Where did he go to school? What grade was he in? Did he play sports? What was his favorite subject? She was in full nurse mode, trying to assess and organize and make sense of everything. We ordered lunch from this Chinese place nearby and sat around my coffee table eating lo mein and asking Sydney about his life. He told us he was in 10th grade, that he liked video games and basketball, that he'd always wanted siblings growing up. My mother sat quietly the whole time, barely eating, just watching the three of us talk. At one point, I caught her crying and she quickly wiped her eyes and apologized, and asked her why she came to the wedding if she knew she might be seen. Our mother said she'd been invited by Troy's mother who'd been her friend years ago. She debated for months before deciding to go. She said she just wanted to see us as adults, even from across a room. She'd planned to stay hidden, but Adrian had recognized her. I asked Sydney if he'd known about us his whole life, and he said yes. Our mother had told him when he was young that he had two older sisters she couldn't see. He'd asked why about a million times, and she'd always said it was complicated, that she'd made mistakes he couldn't fix, and asked if our mother had been a good mom to him, and Sydney got quiet. Then he said she tried her best, but she'd been sad a lot. He said there were days she could barely get out of bed, that she'd worked constantly to provide for him, but emotionally she'd been somewhere else. Our mother started crying harder then. She said she was sorry, that Sydney deserved better, that we all deserved better. She said she'd spent 13 years living with what she'd done, and it had destroyed her from the inside, and got up and hugged her, just like that, no hesitation. She said we can't change the past, but maybe we can figure out the future. I wasn't quite there yet, but watching and hug our mother, while Sydney sat there looking like he might cry too. I felt something shift. These were my people, broken and messy, but mine. Over the next few weeks, Sydney became a regular part of our lives. Our mother would drive him down from Harrisburg on weekends and we'd hang out. We went to a Phillies game. We tried this new escape room place in King of Prussia. We just did normal sibling stuff and it felt weirdly right. Our mother joined us sometimes. At first it was awkward. None of us knew how to act around her, but slowly we started learning who she actually was, not just who we'd imagined or remembered. She told us about her job as a secretary in Harrisburg, about her apartment with her cat Button, about how she volunteered at a food bank on Saturdays because helping people made her feel slightly less guilty about her own life, and asked her about leaving Dad, and our mother finally told us the full story. She said Dad had been controlling in ways that made her feel suffocated. He'd wanted to know where she was every minute, who she talked to, what she spent money on. She'd felt like she couldn't breathe. That didn't make leaving okay, but it made it make more sense. She said she'd met Timothy at work and he'd made her feel seen and valued in ways she hadn't felt in years. She'd had an affair, and when Dad found out, the marriage exploded. She'd left planning to get space and figure things out, but Dad had told her if she wanted out, she was out completely. She couldn't have it both ways. She'd panicked and run. By the time she'd calmed down enough to think clearly, Dad had already told us she was dead. When she tried to contact him to see us, he threatened to make us hate her if she ever came near us again. I asked her why she believed him, and she said because he'd been so angry and she'd been so ashamed. She said she'd convinced herself we were better off without her. Sydney said he'd found letters she'd written to us over the years. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, letters about her life. She'd written them but never sent them, just kept them in a box in her closet. Our mother brought the box to Anne's place one Saturday. Inside were years of letters addressed to me and Anne. Cards for birthdays we'd celebrated without her. Little presents she'd bought but never given us. Photos she'd collected from mutual friends. Reading those letters broke something in me because I could feel her pain in every word. She hadn't forgotten us. She hadn't moved on. She'd been trapped in her own guilt and grief for 13 years. One letter for my 16th birthday said she'd driven by my high school that day and seen me laughing with friends. She wrote that I looked happy and beautiful and that maybe she'd made the right choice staying away. I cried reading that because I hadn't been happy. I'd been pretending, performing, trying to be okay for Dad, and while inside I was still that 12-year-old girl who'd lost her mother. And I decided we needed to talk to Dad, not to ambush him, but to help him understand what we were learning. We invited him to dinner at Anne's place. When he walked in and saw our mother sitting there, he stopped dead and said we'd asked him here to talk, all of us together, like adults. Dad sat down stiffly. I told him we'd been spending time with Mom and Sydney and that we were starting to understand her side of what happened. I said we weren't excusing her leaving, but we were trying to understand it. Dad said there was nothing to understand. She abandoned her family. Our mother said she'd left a toxic marriage and then been threatened into staying away. Dad said that was that he'd only threatened to tell us the truth about her. Sydney asked what truth, and Dad said that she was a cheater who chose another man over her children. Our mother said yes, she'd had an affair, but she'd wanted to work things out and Dad had refused. He'd given her an ultimatum: stay and accept his conditions or leave and never come back. Dad said that wasn't how it happened. He said she'd been the one who left, who walked out the door and didn't look back. They argued back and forth like this for a while and finally shouted for both of them to stop. She said it didn't matter anymore who was right about what happened 13 years ago. What mattered was what we did now. I told Dad that I loved him and appreciated everything he'd done raising us alone. But I also said he'd lied to us about Mom being dead and that had hurt me in ways I was still dealing with. I said I needed him to accept that Mom was going to be part of our lives now. Dad looked at me for a long time. Then he asked if that's really what I wanted. I said yes, and said yes too. He asked about Sydney and I said Sydney was our brother and we wanted a relationship with him. Dad nodded slowly and said okay. He tried to accept it. Our mother said she wasn't asking Dad to forgive her or even to speak to her. She just wanted a chance to know her daughters and for her son to know his sisters. Dad said fine, but he didn't want to be around for it. He'd respect our choices, but he couldn't watch her play happy family after everything she'd done. That hurt, but I understood. Some wounds don't heal just because everyone wants them to. Over the next 2 months, things started to feel more normal. Sydney and our mother started coming to Philadelphia more often, sometimes staying the weekend at a hotel nearby so Sydney wouldn't miss too much school. Having them visit regularly made everything easier. The four of us, me, and Sydney, and our mother started having regular Sunday dinners, sometimes at Anne's place, sometimes at mine, sometimes at this diner halfway between Philadelphia and Harrisburg. That became a regular spot. Our mother told us stories about her childhood, her parents who'd both passed away years ago, what she'd been like before she'd become the sad woman we'd known. Sydney told us about growing up in Harrisburg, about his friends at school, about learning to cook because our mother worked late shifts, and told stories about raising me after Mom left, how she tried to be like a second mother even though she was only 15. I told them about the nightmares I'd had for years, how I'd been afraid to love anyone because what if they disappeared too? One Sunday, our mother brought a photo album she'd kept hidden for years, pictures of me and Anne as babies, as toddlers, family photos from before everything fell apart. Sydney had never seen them, and he stared at the photos like he was trying to memorize them. There was one photo of all of us, Mom, Dad, Anne, and me at the beach. Anne was maybe 4 and I was 2. We were building a sandcastle and everyone was smiling. Our mother said that was the last good day she remembered before things started getting bad with Dad, and asked if she missed him, and our mother said sometimes. Not the angry version of him, but the man she'd married, the one who'd made her laugh and had held her when she was scared and had wanted to build a life with her. I realized then that my parents' marriage hadn't been all bad. There had been love once, before it turned into something toxic and painful. 3 months after that first meeting with Sydney, my mother did something unexpected. She asked if she could meet Adrian to thank him. She said if he hadn't recognized her at the wedding and told me, we might never have found each other again. I called Adrian and explained everything that had happened. He said he'd be happy to meet her. We all met for lunch in Center City. Me, Adrian, my mother, and Sydney. My mother thanked Adrian for speaking up, even though it had been awkward. She said she'd been terrified when he'd recognized her, but that it had led to getting her daughters back. Adrian said he was glad it had worked out. Then he said something that surprised me. He said he'd always felt guilty for not saying something sooner. That maybe if he'd reached out right after the wedding, things could have resolved faster. I told him everything had happened in its own time and that was okay. After lunch, Anne pulled me aside and said she wanted to try something. She wanted to invite Mom and Dad to the same place and see if they could have a civil conversation. I said that was a terrible idea, but Anne insisted. She said we couldn't move forward with our family split down the middle, so we planned a family barbecue at this park near Anne's place. We invited everyone, Dad, Mom, Sydney, Troy, even Adrian since he'd been part of the story. We figured in a public place with other people around, Dad and Mom would have to be civil. The day of the barbecue, I was so nervous I almost canceled, but Sydney sent me a text saying we could do this, that it was time to try. Dad showed up first, then Mom arrived with Sydney. They stared at each other across the picnic area for a minute before Dad walked over. He didn't hug her or anything, but he said hello and asked how she was doing. She said she was okay and asked about him. He said he was fine. That retirement was treating him well. It was awkward and stiff, but it was something. We grilled burgers and hot dogs. We played frisbee. Sydney challenged Dad to a game of horseshoes and Dad actually smiled. At one point, I saw Dad and Mom standing near the grill talking quietly, not yelling, just talking. When I walked over, Dad was telling her about his new hobby, woodworking. Mom was saying Dad said maybe Sydney would be interested in learning sometime, that it was good for kids to know how to build things with their hands. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As the sun started setting, we all sat around the picnic table eating watermelon and said we should do this regularly. That Sunday dinners were great, but we needed bigger family gatherings too. Everyone agreed. Even Dad nodded. Our mother said she wanted to say something. She said she knew she'd hurt everyone at that table in different ways. She said she was sorry for leaving, for staying away, for all the years we'd lost. She said she couldn't change the past, but she wanted to be part of our futures if we'd let her. Dad didn't say he forgave her, but he said we'd all made mistakes, and that life was too short to stay angry forever. He said for the sake of his daughters and for Sydney, who was just a kid caught up in all this mess, he was willing to try to move forward. Mom started crying again, but this time they were happy tears. Last week was my birthday, and for the first time in 13 years, my mother was there to celebrate it. She brought me a cake she'd baked herself, chocolate with raspberry filling, which was my favorite as a kid. The fact that she remembered made me cry. We took a family photo that day, all of us. Dad, Mom, and Troy, Sydney, and me. It was the first photo of all of us together since I was 12. I printed that photo and put it on my fridge. Sometimes I look at it and can't believe this is my life now. That my dead mother is alive. That I have a brother. That my broken family is slowly piecing itself back together. To that elderly woman at Costco, thank you. You saw someone following me and you spoke up. You had no idea what you were setting in motion, but because of you, I got my mother back. I found a brother I didn't know existed. And to everyone who commented on my posts, thank you for letting me vent and process this insanity.